If you're watching this, just know that I've written this video about 6 times and I finally got a script I liked. This one's been in the works for about a year now. Anyway, I've mentioned in videos before that you have no better tool in your railfan arsenal, if that's a thing, than the radio. ATCS Monitor is fantastic, but it's only available on lines with CTC and that are still using some form of radio code line. The radio can go anywhere, works in track warrant territory, and is something you can use from home without even having to go outside. Nice for those of us where the white stuff falls from the sky for 3 to 5 months a year. So today we're going to get into one of my favorite subjects in the Back to Basics series, the radio. Before we begin, a word about the radio frequencies we're actually concerned with here. What's usually called the railroad band is a set of 97 channels in the 160 and 161 MHz VHF range. There are actually channels between these 97, but as of yet there's very little use of these, and generally you'll be good just paying attention to the standard 97. Channel numbers are assigned by the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, although Canadian and Mexican railroads are also involved. Some channels are also not used in the US, but have channel numbers anyway. As of 2023, virtually all railroads are still using good old analog radios, compared to police and fire departments, many of which have switched in the last 20 years to some form of digital radio system. Because of this, essentially any scanner will work to hear the railroads, whether it's brand new or 40 years old. Railroads do have chunks of spectrum elsewhere though. PTC uses frequencies in the 220 MHz range. EOTs and wireless DPUs use frequencies in the 450 MHz range. And where it's still in use, ATCS and related technologies use 890 and 930 MHz and surrounding frequencies. With very few exceptions, you won't hear voice from railroads anywhere outside the VHF band unless they have licenses in the business radio band. From my experience, this is very rare, and the data frequencies are of very little use without a computer to decode them, so we'll be focusing here on the VHF voice band. There are 3 different categories of radio that we'll talk about today. The first, and the one I would recommend for most people, is the scanner. Scanners have the most additional features: fast scan rates, the ability to find nearby signals, search by radio service, weather alert, alpha tagging of memory channels, just to name a few. Most modern scanners boast scan rates up to 100 channels per second. This means you can scan the entire railroad radio band in a little less than a second. Realistically, though, you won't need to scan every channel. I do, just because I'm near Chicago and there's a lot going on, but especially if you live on a line that's isolated from any others, you'll only need a few. The more you scan and the slower your scan rate, the higher your risk of missing transmissions. Uniden is the most widespread scanner brand right now, and one of the more popular models is the BC125AT. I consider this an entry-level scanner that can only do the VHF and UHF bands. If you want to listen to anything on 800 MHz or higher, this won't do it. You can go higher in features, but you'll go higher in price. My BCD 325P2 is basically the same radio with 800 and higher, plus a few digital modes and trunk radio, which is in use by many police and fire departments. If you only want railroads, though, the 125 will do just fine. However, there's a problem. If you put scanner into a search box on a site like Amazon or eBay, chances are somewhere in the first few results will be, these are not scanners and you need to stay away from them if you don't know what it is. And it brings us to our second category, amateur two-way radios. This is the Baofeng, and they are infamous in the amateur radio world, and I guess you could say the radio world in general. So why do I not recommend these for most people? Well, remember when I mentioned scan rate? With Baofengs, you could probably hit the channel up button faster than the radio would scan. It's painfully slow. If you're trying to scan more than 4 or 5 channels at a time, you'll likely miss things. Second, these are not scanners. Scanners cannot transmit. These are two-way radios. Because of this, unless you program it not to, it will transmit on any frequency you put in it. Oh, and you can't program it not to unless you connect it to a computer. On top of those things, the receivers in these are just not very good. If you live in an area with many strong signals, they can be easily overloaded, and you'll miss transmissions or hear things from different frequencies on the frequency you're actually trying to listen to. This is called intermodulation, or intermod for short. If you're a race fan, you'll be familiar with this too. This is why they tell you to use a stubby antenna or no antenna at all on your scanner at the track. More signal is not always a good thing. However, I myself have multiple Baofangs. They do have a use. They are super cheap, so if it gets lost or broken, it's really not a huge deal. The battery life on them is fantastic. The flashlight isn't the best, but if you have nothing else and need it, it's kind of handy. And the FM radio, again, is kind of nice if you need it. Oh, and it can sort of listen to 2 channels at once, although this isn't entirely true, but close enough, and it works well enough. I will not mince words here. If you decide for whatever reason to go with a 2-way radio, do not leave the ability to transmit on. But Tyler, in an emergency, you're allowed to use any frequency available to you. Just stop. If the railroads wanted to hear from you, they'll give you a radio. But there's an emergency. Does your phone work? Every grade crossing has a sign with a phone number on it to call in the event of an emergency. Pressing that button on your radio, intentionally or unintentionally, will possibly get you a visit from a 3-letter federal agency. Besides that, it potentially puts crews in danger if the crew who is actually authorized to use the frequency can't communicate because you leaned up against the wall and pushed the button and now your radio is jamming the entire frequency. It's a really, really bad idea. If you want to talk on your radio, get a ham license. Do not leave the ability to transmit on railroad frequencies on, period. And this applies to Baofangs and any of the other inexpensive Chinese radios you can find online. However, with more reputable amateur equipment manufacturers, I would suggest you use them with the caveat that you don't transmit anywhere you're not authorized. I use a Yaesu FTM 300D in the car, and these will only transmit in the amateur bands, but I can listen outside of them, and they're actually pretty good at it. I actually use the 300 to record much of my audio in the field. You'll give up a few features when compared to scanners, though, so they won't be for everyone. I like Yaesus, but there's also ICOM and Kenwood. Our final category, we have commercial 2-way radios, often called Part 90 radios because they're approved by the FCC under Part 90 rules, which govern commercial radio systems. Like Baofangs, these are full-blown 2-way radios, and transmit needs to be locked out. All the features you'd get on other kinds of radios, gone. Ability to program in the field without a computer? Nope. So why would you get one? Well, for one thing, the receivers are second to none. They work very well. But they're expensive, usually pretty heavy, and if you don't know your way around one, you can get lost very fast. I have a Kenwood TK2180, but another popular model for the railroads is the NX210 that adds NXDN digital. However, if you're buying your first radio, then I would highly, highly recommend you stay away from anything that transmits. Also keep in mind that almost all commercial radios are single band only, meaning if you want to use them on both VHF and UHF, you can't. Again, if you're only interested in the railroads, then it's not really a big deal. You could also throw in software-defined radios called SDRs, although they're limited by where you can take the computer they're plugged into, and usually aren't the best performers. But if you want a simple solution for ATCS or decoding EOTs, then they'll work great for you. My portable ATCS setup is an SDR stick with a Windows tablet. Within these categories, there are 3 models of radio: base, mobile, and portable. Base radios are designed to be in a fixed location and will run off a regular old outlet. Mobile radios go in a car and are required to be connected to the battery. And portable radios are handhelds powered off their own batteries. I should also mention to check your local regulations. Some states restrict the use of radios capable of receiving police radio frequencies in vehicles. Minnesota, Indiana, Kentucky, New York, and Florida. You can Google to find more about these laws, and how tightly they're actually enforced is not really clear. But they're there, and the Kentucky law even allows the radio to be taken and destroyed on top of fines. Amateur radio operators are typically exempt from these laws, so yet another reason to get your ticket. Realistically, as long as you're smart about it, you should be fine. It also does not prohibit using a radio in your house. Antenna also matters. If you're operating in a car, you'll need one outside the vehicle for the best performance. This also applies at home. The higher you can get your antenna, the better. Mine is up on the roof on an old dish mount. If you don't want it outside, the attic will work too. If you use an outdoor antenna, of course, make sure you ground it properly and follow local restrictions and all that fun stuff. The antenna that comes with most portable radios is fine, but usually not great, and you'd do well to upgrade it. So what do I use? Well, I mentioned I have a Yaesu FTM300D in my vehicle. If I have that, that's how I record. I've also used a Uniden BCD396XT to record. My current favorite portable is the ICOM ICR6, which is a very wideband, nice little receiver, even doing AM broadcast, which is nice. Although it isn't a commercial radio, the performance is about as good. I also use a Baofeng UV S9 Plus. It's my, I don't care, cheap radio. I actually have two of them. One you may have seen in the picture I put up from Rochelle a while back. It's nice for somewhere like Rochelle because you have to listen to both road channels to get the whole picture. It also charges through USB, which is nice for traveling. At home I use a Radio Shack Pro 197, which they haven't made for years now. This is the radio that you may have heard in the background of my voiceovers, like this one, although I've tried to minimize this recently. That radio stays on 24/7 and scans all channels. I also have an SDS 200 as my main radio, and while it's great at public safety, it's not very good on VHF compared to the Radio Shack. Sometimes at home I'll use my Yaesu FTM 100D too, which is my amateur transceiver at my desk. Every once in a while I'll use my Kenwood TK2182, but since I got the ICOM receiver I prefer it if it's charged. The Kenwood has a big speaker and great performance, but the battery life isn't super great. Now that we've got the radios themselves out of the way, how about we talk a little bit about how to use them. This video is long enough though, and I feel like I left a lot out, so we'll leave that for part 2, where we'll actually talk about the different types of channels and take a road trip where we radio Railfan along the way. You can follow me on Instagram and read the blog. Links are in the video description. Until next time, I'm Tyler, and thank you for watching the Northeastern Illinois Railfan YouTube channel.